the Queen's Gambit. So today I'll be talking about the Queen's Gambit, how the Queen's Gambit is accepted, how the Queen's Gambit is denied, although I'll mostly focus on the accepted part and some of the different variations. So I'd start with moving my pawn to d4. Black moves the pawn to d5. I'd move the pawn from c2 to c4. If black takes the pawn in c4, then the Queen's Gambit has been accepted. So I can open up by moving the pawn from e2 to e3, giving access to my bishop for the bishop to be able to get the pawn in c4. If black decides to keep hold of the pawn to still protect the pawn, black can move the pawn to b5. When black moves the pawn to b5, I'll move my pawn to a4. If black decides to defend the pawn in a4, black can move the pawn to a6. If the pawn has been moved to a6, I'll simply take the pawn in b5. Already you can see more of my pieces are opened. I have initiated the attack. So black is more of at a disadvantage. He can't really take the pawn because the rook will be opened and unprotected. I'll simply take a free pawn. Black can move the bishop to d7, but still black will lose more pieces if he decides to keep hold of the pawn using the first variation. The second variation is that black would decide to protect the pawn in b5 by moving the pawn from c7 to c6. If black does that, I'll still take the pawn in b5. Taking the pawn in b5, black takes back the pawn, and I'll simply move my queen from d1 to f3. By moving my queen from d1 to f3, I've been given access to black's rook. So if black decides to defend the rook, he has to give me another piece in exchange. Black can defend by giving me a free bishop. I'll take the bishop. Black opens up so that the rook is saved, and I'll keep on taking more pieces. As you can see, I have more of the advantage if black decides to keep hold or to keep protecting the pawn by moving the piece from c7 to c6. The other variation is where black defends the pawn using the bishop. If black uses the bishop, I can move my knight from b1 to c3, so that I would later move the pawn from d4 to d5. So black, with the intention of still keeping hold of the pawn, will move his pawn from c7 to c6. I can still go on by moving my pawn from e3 to e4. As you can see, at this point, black can't really defend the pawn. One way he can try to is by moving his pawn from b7 to b5. I'll simply engage more of my pieces. He takes the pawn, I take the pawn. The only possible, or the only logical, not possible, the only logical solution here is for him to retreat by moving his bishop from e6 back to d7. When black does that, he has restricted his bishop. So this gives me more of an advantage to now open up my pieces in whichever way I see fit. At this point, I have the advantage. So the Queen's Gambit is about giving myself an advantage, opening up more of my pieces. As you can see, I started this match aggressively. Most of black's pieces are still stationary. So this is the Queen's Gambit accepted. These are some of the variations. There are many variations in which this can go, but these are some of the common variations. Let's look at the Queen's Gambit. Denied. Let me flip this. Now black, let's reset the board. So the Queen's Gambit starts. White moves the piece to c4. When white moves the piece to c4, I can simply move my piece from my pawn from e7 to e6. Just one small step. I have declined the Queen's Gambit. So if you are playing against someone and you see your opponent starting with the move in d4, when you counter with d5 and you see your opponent moves his or her piece from c2 to c4, just know that you're about to fall trap to the Queen's Gambit. So just simply move your piece to e4, then you have denied the Queen's Gambit. When you move your piece to c6, then you have initiated the Slav defense against the Queen's Gambit. I'll talk about the Slav defense in my other videos. Then that was about the Queen's Gambit accepting and declining. Then one way that I like to start the Queen's Gambit for me is that there are other people who like memorize steps. So just one simple step out of the ordinary can confuse the opponent. So instead of starting the Queen's Gambit with my piece to d4, I usually start with c4. If my opponent goes or moves the piece to d5, I will go to d4. As you can see, we're back to the original position of the Queen's Gambit. But others, when we reach this position, they fail to notice that it's still the Queen's Gambit, because some players usually just memorize, so they're used to the Queen's Gambit starting with d4, even though we can clearly see that from this position it's back to the same position as if we started the piece in d4. But this can be something that some of our opponents cannot realize, so they might accept and it goes on. That's how I start my Queen's Gambit. So thank you guys for tuning in. If you have any requests on openings that I can do, feel free to let me know in the comment box. You can also let me know if I missed some variations, although one thing to note is that there are many different variations. So we just talk about the common ones, and that's how the Queen's Gambit is.